Let's go ahead and go over to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, let's read verses 19 down through 24. Daniel 7, 19 through 24. Daniel says, "Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. And thus he said," this one whom he asked of this vision, Daniel did, "Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings." Okay, as we look at this fourth kingdom, this fourth beast of Daniel's vision here in Daniel chapter 7, there are some similarities between this fourth kingdom and the one that Daniel talked about in Daniel chapter 2. The similarities extend to the point that in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel says there is sort of a remnant of that which was the Roman Empire remaining in the fourth kingdom, and it is one in which you find that is mixed with the sons of men, as he describes it. In other words, you find that what is described in this fourth kingdom that finally arises is that it comes out of elements of what was the Roman Empire. And it is true today that when we look at our governments, we do have elements of what was true in Roman government in our governments today. And so that idea that some of what was characteristic of the Roman Empire would become spread out among humanity in this fourth kingdom is a parallel that we see in Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 2 about the fourth kingdom. However, Daniel 7 expands on the information on the fourth kingdom more so for us and gives us some specifics about it, which makes it a little more specific than what we see in Daniel chapter 2. And so tonight, what I'd like to do with Daniel's description here of the fourth kingdom is we'll run through this here and see what he describes are the key characteristics of this fourth kingdom. And as we see this, Daniel is describing something that's going to happen in the future. This fourth kingdom, as Daniel visualizes it, sees it in his vision, is one that is yet to come. It's not one that is in existence now. It's not one that has been in existence in the past. Although in the Roman Empire there were some similarities, there's still specifics that are described here in Daniel chapter 7 that move this kingdom out of purely being satisfied by the Roman Empire. So this is one that is yet to come. And when we see the characteristics of this kingdom, we kind of wonder, wow, how does humanity get to the point where they are willing to accept what this kingdom does? Because if this kingdom were to come into play today, right now, for the most part, kingdoms of the world would say, no way, I'm not having any part of that. I don't want it. But yet the Bible says this will happen. So that means between now and the time that this kingdom arises, there are certain things that must begin, there are certain things that must happen within humanity that prepares them for this fourth kingdom. Now, there's a very real possibility that, as we'll see here in the description of this, that a lot of what happens with this fourth kingdom in solidifying it and bringing it into existence is a result of the rapture. For when the rapture does happen, there's going to be a chunk of people that all of a sudden are missing. There's going to be questions about how this happens. There's going to be a great fear that does descend upon people because all of a sudden people are gone and they have no explanation for this. And so it does become very ripe and very fertile for these types of things that are described in this fourth kingdom to come together and the fourth kingdom then to explode into existence. But I think what we see also happening here is that as God describes for us this fourth kingdom, he's also describing for us the progression of mankind through history, and we can very clearly see that some of the things that are happening or going to happen in the fourth kingdom are even happening right now. So, that having said, let's look at how Daniel here is given information about this fourth kingdom. For this fourth kingdom describes a global kingdom with consolidated power in a few, which subdues and refashions civilization. The result of this fourth kingdom is that what has been going on within civilization is completely changed. So this is a global kingdom with consolidated power in a few, which subdues and refashions civilization. That's a summation of what we see happening in this passage of Scripture. So how does it get there? How does mankind get to the point where there's a global kingdom with few that are in power and they are able to subdue the whole world and change the way that man has lived? Well, we find some clues here. So first of all, in the explanation that's given to Daniel here in verse 23, we find that Daniel is given an explanation of this kingdom. It's revealed, first of all, that this is a unique kingdom. This is a unique kingdom. Verse 23, the fourth kingdom shall be, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different. And that's the key point here, because it says, which shall be different from all other kingdoms. And the point about this that Daniel is told in that it is different is that there has never been a rule over mankind like this one that will happen. There's never been one in the past like this one. There's never been one even up to this point. That's why it is still to come. Because when you look at the kingdoms that are in authority, the governments that are ruling today, they run along a timeline. And there are similarities with what we see now as what we've seen in the past. But this kingdom is described as being different. And what's unique about it being different, it's a kingdom that is different because it replaces, it alters, it changes the other kingdoms. That is a key feature of this fourth kingdom. It's not essentially the fact that this kingdom suddenly arises and is different from the others. It's the fact that out of the others, there have been changes, there have been alterations that have occurred that bring forth, that contribute to this kingdom and its ascendancy. So it's a kingdom that is different because it replaces, it alters, it changes what the other kingdoms have been like. And that's something to remember about what's being described here. It also is a kingdom that is radically different. It's radically different from the others because Scripture says here that it is a kingdom which shall be different from all other kingdoms. There's never, ever has been or will be until this kingdom shows up, a kingdom like it, because it is radically different. And because it is radically different, it gets there by changing, by altering these other kingdoms. What this describes is that it's a kingdom that has radical ideas, but these radical ideas at first seem to be ones that are, they're too far out there. I mean, it's impossible that that could happen. But as things are changed and as things are altered, there begins to be an acceptance of those radical ideas. And that's the basis on which we see this kingdom coming forth. What this describes for us then is this. It's called gradualism. Gradualism is the rise of radical ideas that at first are so extreme it's impossible for them to happen, but when you begin to alter, when you begin to change, when you begin to tweak things a little bit, introduce a little bit at a time, you gradually get to the point where that which is radical is accepted. So there is going to be, and there is now a rise in gradualism. So one of the things we can look for is there happening within our society and culture the introduction of radical ideas? And at first these radical ideas are like, oh, no way, that's not going to happen. But then we get to where we accept that radical idea because there has been a small implementation of it over and over again. All right, just a case in point. A year ago, when the Wuhan virus showed up, and people were walking around with masks, it was like, no way, that's not going to happen. Who's going to wear a mask? Well, guess what we're doing today? It's gradualism. Because there was a point in time at which that was such a radical idea, it was not going to be acceptable, but then it kept being presented in different forms and in different ways and gradually is accepted. Okay, that's just an illustration of what this type of thing is. Okay, so first of all, it's a unique kingdom. Why? Because it alters, it changes gradually the structure of previous kingdoms to implement radical ideas. Number two, we find out about this kingdom that it's a global united kingdom. A global united kingdom. Verse 23, it says, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all others, and shall devour the whole earth. It'll devour the whole earth. All right, what's the idea of devouring something? If you put a plate of hamburgers in front of some teenage boys, and then 5 minutes later they're all gone, what do you say about it? Man, those guys devoured those hamburgers. Where did those hamburgers go? Well, they went down into the endless pit. And you can put another plate in front of them. Those will be gone as well. You put 3 or 4 plates in front of them, and they will all be gone very efficiently. Why? Because teenage boys are very good at devouring food. And the idea of devouring is that it completely takes over it, doesn't it? So the description of the kingdom here is one in which it is a global, united kingdom. In other words, the ideals of this kingdom and its rule will have global acceptance. The ideals of this kingdom and rule will have global acceptance. It's not a regional thing that is being described here. It's not a Western against Eastern. It's not Russia versus China. But rather, this is a global acceptance. And it's describing the fact here that humanity in general, all the way around the world, is locked into and is accepting of the ideals that are being promoted by this kingdom. What does this describe? Well, this describes the rise of globalism. And we should see within society and culture, if God says this kind of stuff is going to happen, where you have people around the world universally accepting an idea, that there will be a rise of what we would call globalism. And guess what? There is a rise of globalism happening. Because there are concepts that are being pushed around the world that are being accepted by countries around the world because of an organization called the United Nations. The United Nations has what's called a 2030 agenda right now. The 2030 agenda has 17 points. Among those points are points like the elimination of poverty, the elimination of hunger, the elimination of unsustainable resources, i.e. fossil fuel, climate change. See, climate change is becoming a thing that is accepted globally and is being pushed by a global narrative. And the United Nations, with their 2030 agenda, has 100 and plus some nations signed into it, one of which is Canada. And you can find that Canada has a page which is called Canada's 2030 agenda, which is to implement these things that the United Nations says, as a global community, mankind should do. So there's a rise in globalism. And in order for nations which are sovereign to accept the rule of a few over them in a global setting, there has to be the beginnings of the framing of the mindset that we don't just live in a country, but rather what we're doing in a country has an impact on everybody else in the world. And so we need to watch out for everybody else in the world. And together as a world, we need to solve our problems. Guess what one of the phrases was and is that showed up after this Wuhan virus hit the world in the pandemic? We're all in this together. That's a global idea. Okay, so the rise of globalism is described here. The third thing we find is that it's a confederate kingdom. A confederate kingdom. Verse 24 says, the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. Now it's interesting, the Bible says they will arise from this kingdom, which means that you have ideals, you've got rule that is happening, you've got things that are being accepted by this idea of this kingdom that is global, but out of that you have a consolidation of power. And the consolidation of power is described here as 10 kings. Now, if there are 130 nations, 132 I believe it is, that have signed into the UN agenda of 2030 and the implementation of all these things, if there are 130 nations, how many heads of state are there going to be? 130. And see, initially there's this move on the part to bring everybody together, but when this kingdom is installed, there's going to be a consolidation of power that is in just a few. Now, why would the world get to a point where it would trust the rule and reign and decrees of only a few? That is what we're also seeing today. Because as a consolidation of power happens, you have what is called the rise of the oligarchy. That's basically a big word to describe the rise of a rule of few. And it is necessary for the thinking on the part of people today to begin to accept the fact that there are few ruling over the many. And that it's okay for the few to rule over the many. Because God says eventually this kingdom is characterized by that very thing. So you have the rise of oligarchy. Then the fourth thing described about this kingdom in verse 23 is that it is a destructive, ruining kingdom. It's a destructive, ruining kingdom. It's not satisfied with just destroying something and then letting it spring back up again. But the characteristic of this kingdom is described as one that destroys and then ruins, as in completely decimates it. How do we find it described? Well, in verse 23, it says, at the last part of the verse, that this fourth kingdom, the beast, is described as one which tramples and breaks in pieces. It tramples and breaks in pieces. And the idea of trampling is to crush something, right? So you have a bug that goes scurrying across your floor, and you tramp on it. What have you just done? You took your massive foot and you completely obliterated that pure, innocent little bug. You trampled it. You crushed it. You take a pea and squeeze it, and the pea goes, what'd you do? You trampled it. You crushed it. All right? This kingdom is described as one that crushes, but then it also is described as one that breaks in pieces. In other words, that which is whole, that which is working, it completely ruins. The intent of this kingdom is not only to crush, but it is also to destroy what has existed, to ruin it. In fact, we find in verse 19 that Daniel says here of this beast, he adds in a little bit more description here, in which he says about the fourth beast, that it was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze. So the teeth of iron, nails of bronze, it devours and it tramples. It destroys and it crushes. What does it need to do, to have in order to devour, to destroy, to crush? Well, it needs teeth of iron and nails of bronze, both of which are strong metals, both of which are metals which are used defensively, both of which are metals which are used offensively in weapons, and are very effective in destroying. What it describes here about the beast with its iron teeth and nails of bronze is that it has strength of resources. So this kingdom is something that has the strength of resources to be able to ruin, crush, destroy peoples and kingdoms by its resources, by its strength. And so the Bible here describes the fact that here we have the rise of a kingdom that has as its intent the destruction of other kingdoms and peoples, so that they, being in this state of destruction now, are helpless, and the answer is the one that destroyed them. This describes the rise of power and resources in a few. It's interesting that it is tied, this kingdom, to the reign of 10, and the description of this kingdom in the reign of 10, a few over the many, is that the few are intent on destroying the many, so that the many then are helpless, and the few that destroyed them come to the rescue. It describes the rise of devastating the many by the few. Describes the rise of the devastating of the many by the few. And it also describes the rise of reshaping many by the few. Reshaping many by the few. For in verse 24 it says the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. They have come to this position of power, and they, the few, are reshaping all the other kingdoms into the image of what they desired their kingdom to be. Now, how does mankind get to this point? Where they are willing to surrender their civilization, their freedom, their liberty as individuals to the few who ruin and destroy them, and then come riding in on the white horse to rescue them from the damage that they have done. And they're willing to let them do it as a solution. Well, let me give you a few examples here of each of these things that are characteristic of this kingdom. And in giving these examples, I want you to understand that these are characteristics of what's going on right now, which enables what will happen in the future. And we need to understand as believers, number one, God said this is what's going to happen. In order for this kind of kingdom to arise, there has to be a conditioning, there has to be an acceptance, there has to be a training, a forming of people so that they are ready for this kind of thing to happen in the future. And if we see elements of this going on now, it shouldn't surprise us because God has said these things will happen. But secondly, we need to understand that these things that are happening are characteristics of a kingdom that is ruled by one who is described as the Antichrist. Okay, all of this is moving towards a kingdom where the Antichrist is in power. And while it may be true that what these elements we can see happening today, it does not mean that we're living in a time in which the Antichrist is ruling. That's obviously not the case because we do not know who he is. But the Bible does say that there is the spirit of Antichrist in existence in man today. And we see a lot of that. So it should not surprise us if we see these types of things being put forth, that they are not just nice and good ideas to rescue people who are in need. They are driven by an element of spiritual warfare that is an anti-Christ. It's anti-God. And so we need to understand these things and be able to identify them and say, yes, this is part of what God warns us about as being an anti-Christ, anti-God spirit. And the Bible also says that we need to have a sound mind. We're told that God has given us not the spirit of fear, but of a sound mind. And if we are sucked into the things that are being done by this kingdom in order to exploit for their purposes people, then we're not living according to a sound mind. But rather we're being coerced by what is happening around us. Which then leads us to understand, first of all, about this kingdom, or the last thing about this kingdom, really, before we look at these evidence, because this is where it starts and then goes backwards through what we've seen. And that is that this kingdom is a coercive kingdom. Because in verse 7 of chapter 7 here, back up to that one, verse 7 of chapter 7, Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. There are two things that are descriptive of this kingdom from the very start. The first is dreadful and terrible. Dreadful and terrible describe fear. It is something that is creating fear. It is something that causes fear. It is something that instills fear. So the characteristic of this coercive kingdom that gets people to get to where it desires, this anti-Christ, anti-God thinking starts out with fear. I think that's interesting. Because it describes here the rise in exploitation of fear. Exploiting people on the basis of fear. Now, if you think about the events the Bible describes, if this kingdom solely arises because of the rapture happens, the church disappears, you've got millions of people that are suddenly gone from the earth, there's no explanation of it. People are afraid, what's going to happen to me? Because, my family disappeared, my husband disappeared, my bus driver disappeared, the pilot on the plane disappeared. There's great fear about what is going to happen. And it's very possible that with the rapture and then this element of fear, that this kingdom can quickly arise because it exploits that fear at the moment. But I would contend there needs to actually be more of a conditioning before then for people to readily accept the answer of a few in an instance like the rapture. And so what we see happening here is the rise in exploitation of fear. We see a rise in the second thing, in implementation by force. A rise in implementation by force. In other words, what the kingdom wants, it will do by force, because he describes this beast as exceedingly strong. In other words, it's one that no other beast stands up against. No other beast can stop it. It has the resources, it has the strength to put into place and force people to do what it wants it to do. Now, with that understanding, I think obviously you can see some things that have been happening recently that do show us that it is possible, if you exploit fear among people, to get them to do what you want them to do. So, for example, here with the Wuhan virus, the narrative on this virus is that it is a very deadly virus. When it first came out, that's what we were told. Then on top of that, we had video that was coming out of China that showed what was happening. Video that since then we found a lot of it has been edited to frame the narrative. For example, there was a picture that was going around about a Chinese man who died of COVID at the airport. And the picture showed an empty wheelchair. This man was laid out on the floor in what looked like an airport terminal, people around him, and the information that was attached to it was that this was a COVID victim. This is a man that died of the virus in the airport, the assumption being that if he dies in the airport while he's making a trip, this is a pretty deadly virus. Come to find out, that really wasn't the truth about this, but rather was part of an information campaign, disinformation campaign on the part of the Chinese to build up a fear for this virus. Well, on top of that, we're told that there are millions of deaths that are going to be possible. And so because of the millions of deaths that are going to be possible, then you must wear a mask. You must social distance, and you must quarantine. Well, have there been millions of deaths in Canada? You know, I'm not trying to disparage those that have suffered from this disease and have died from it, from this virus, but have there been millions of deaths in Canada? Have there been millions of deaths in the United States? There's not. I think right now the count worldwide is 1 million and a bit total globally of deaths. Yet initially we were told this is going to be in the scores of millions, as in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 million, even up to 100 million people are going to die as a result of this virus. Now, why? Why were we told that? Well, because the spirit of Antichrist is one that wants to exploit fear in the hearts and minds of people. The facts about the virus today that we know are these. Well, we were also told that we need to do what we're doing in order to keep the hospital system from being overrun, which isn't a good thing. You know, you get a bunch of people that get sick and they need help and there's not room for them. That is a problem. Well, factually, within Alberta, there are 8,000 hospital beds. Of those 8,000 hospital beds, I think it's around 1,300, maybe a little bit less, but within that figure, are dedicated to ICU treatment. Okay, so you have 8,000 beds, 1,300-ish ICU. If you take that out, that leaves you with what? 6,700 beds, hospital beds, which have the potential to be able to treat somebody if it is necessary with the COVID virus. Well, over the course of the year that this virus, well, not quite a year now, it'll be March, but over the course of almost a year that this virus has hit in Alberta, guess what the highest number of hospitalizations has been? The highest is around 913. That's just hospitalizations. Hospitalizations plus those that are in ICU. Over the whole course of this thing so far, have exceeded 1,000 and I think it's almost 1,100 total. That's the highest number that we reached with this COVID stuff. And yet we were told this was an extremely deadly disease. This is something that's going to cause hundreds of thousands of deaths. And we got to be careful because we're going to overwhelm our system. And we're even told today that we've got to be extra careful because there are variants of this virus that are coming around that are going to overwhelm our hospital system. So because of that, we've got to take more extreme measures, i.e. double mask, triple mask. Put pantyhose over your triple mask. You see the exploitation of fear? Because when people hear those things like, well, yeah, that's scary. But God has given us not the spirit of fear, but of a sound mind. And the facts that are there now, which you can check for yourself, show us that this virus is not something that is what it was painted to be, but rather that what is being played on is the fear of mankind. It's the exploitation of fear. Now, if it's this easy for governments to exploit the fear of people today, imagine how easy it's going to be for the government that brings in the Antichrist to exploit fear at the time of the rapture to bring about this kingdom. That's why I say this kingdom is something that's not here now. It's going to be in the future, and it's a real kingdom because we see the evidence for it coming into existence in the very times that we are living in. Exploitation of fear. And then the rise in implementation by force. We've seen this. All right? We've gone from where it's been mandated that you have to social distance to where it's been mandated that you have to wear a mask, to where it's been mandated that you can't walk out of your house. Well, not quite that, but where you've been quarantined to your house, you can't have any kind of social activity with anyone at all, any place else, but you got to stay in your house. You can't have people in your house. And then there's been put on top of that that if you do, you can be arrested. And people have been arrested. Now that's an implementation by force. You know, the greater example of this right now is the latest mandate which Prime Minister Trudeau has put into place, and it's based on the Quarantine Act. I don't know how many of you have read the Quarantine Act. But I got to tell you, the Quarantine Act is a bad piece of legislation. I don't know how it managed to get passed in the first place, but it is a bad piece. Here's why it's a bad piece. Because in the Quarantine Act, the Prime Minister is allowed, based on the belief of an overwhelming plague or sickness, to mandate quarantining in government facilities. And guess what the Prime Minister has done? He has stated that as of February 22nd, if you are returning from out of country into Canada, that when you fly in, not only do you have to have proof of a recent COVID test, PC test, negative, but also, when you land, you will be taken to a government facility where you await the results of another COVID test. And by the way, the government facilities are right now hotels that have been approved near the airports. That's kind of economically convenient, isn't it? But when you get taken to the hotel, you're not allowed to contact any of your family. It's surrounded by barriers so that nobody else can come visit you. You are locked into your room. You're checked every day for temperature and so forth and signs of COVID. You are given food, meals, as if you are literally a prisoner. It's that kind of thing. But he has mandated this. So for 3 days, you've got to hang out there. If you test negative, you're allowed to go home if you have a good quarantine plan. However, when you get home, you also are going to be checked up on by the former RCMP officers and military officers hired for that purpose, to check up and make sure that you are quarantining. And if you're not, you get arrested. You can get fined an exorbitant amount. Now, again, this is the enforcement because there is the implementation of things upon people because there is the power and the force of the government to be able to do so. And yet we say, we look at this picture that's painted for us in the Bible and wonder, how in the world will it be that people will subject themselves to the rule of a few and willingly put themselves under the implementation of things that you normally would not be subjected to, but you're willing to give yourself to it, and they enforce it by force? Well, we see that kind of thing happening today, don't we? Furthermore, we find, like in the U.S., right now the capital of the United States is still occupied by 6,000 National Guard. During the inauguration, there were 25,000 National Guard troops in Washington, D.C. It was locked down like a war zone. Nobody was allowed near where traditionally the inauguration has taken place. That area from the Capitol building all the way back is called the Washington Mall. And usually it is flooded with people, hundreds of thousands of people there to witness this event. This time around, not a single person, except for a few stragglers. And Washington was locked down. How is it that a country that is known for its freedom has allowed its very capital to still be under the occupational control of the military? Well, same thing. The willingness to implement by force ungodly and antichrist agendas. We're being conditioned for this. We find with big tech today, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, are censoring and knocking off conservatives and those that dissent or those that are trying to get information out there that people should know about. They are controlling that information. And people are okay with it. See, these kind of things need to happen within culture, within society, within civilization, so that the arise of this kingdom can come to pass. For the more you gradually introduce the concept and condition people to it, the greater and easier it is to accept it. What do we find out about the reshaping? The rise of the reshaping of the many by the few. Let me give you a few quick examples here of this, because these are things that are being and want to be implemented. You've probably heard about the Great Reset. Probably heard that phrase. That phrase recently was made popular by Prime Minister Trudeau. Back in November, he in a Zoom conference with other UN leaders openly discussed and admitted the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic provides a great opportunity for us for a great reset. And Canada has signed in on the agenda of this great reset. What does it mean? Basically, the Great Reset is an idea that is floated and talked about on the part of the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum every year around January, end of it, they meet in Davos, Switzerland. The world's elite, rich, come together, and for a week, they have this gab fest. And they're out of this, the circulation of ideas coming from these people is an agenda that is being put out there in order to reset the way that the world's economies are working so that there is an equalization globally for everybody. Another word for equalization of economy or economics is socialism. And the gist of what they want is this. They want to take corporations, and instead of a corporation being privately owned, the corporation is now owned by the government. The corporation then is producing and doing and making product, but based on sustainability, as in the benefit for the global community. So if how you are making your tennis shoes doesn't benefit and isn't good for the laborer in the company that you are, or in the country that you're doing it, you're not doing it in a sustainable manner. If the tennis shoes you are making involves fossil fuel in its production, you are spewing carbon into the atmosphere, and therefore it is not a sustainable endeavor. Furthermore, companies they want them to be owned by the government, and then in being owned by the government, to be taxed by the government, so that they ultimately can provide a universal income for people. Now, why would they provide a universal income for people? Because if you want to reset the way that Western economies, the way that our economies work, there is a significant chunk of that economy that has to be destroyed in order for it to be reshaped. And guess what that significant chunk is? It's us sitting here today. It's those that are in the middle. And the ones that have been hit the worst right now with the COVID-19 stuff is the very people in the middle. It's the ones that run the small businesses. And factually, Amazon has had a huge year. And what we've seen is that the divide between those that have a whole bunch of money, Amazon, Apple, these corporations that have made well, during the COVID pandemic, they have increased quite a bit on their bottom line. But those that are in the middle, the little guy, the one that runs the home, the small business, the middle income class earner has been devastated. I think I saw the statistic the other day, something like almost 200,000 restaurants in the United States will never reopen their doors. In Canada, it's well into the tens of thousands of restaurants that will never open their doors again. You've got people that are out of work, and they don't have any hope right now of a future of being able to get back into work, because even if the work is opened up, it's so limited, it does not provide the basis of meeting a mortgage. So when the middle class becomes devastated and cannot provide for its mortgage, for its sustainability, for its basic needs, World Economic Forum has suggested, well, why don't we have a universal income? Now, how do you get people to accept a universal income? Which basically means everybody gets a sustaining wage. So, for example, everybody in Canada would get a sustaining wage of $20,000 a year. Everybody, except for. And you know who the except fors are. But everybody within the middle class gets a $2,000 or $20,000 a year universal basic income. Now, most people right off the bat are going to say, no, I want to earn my money. I don't want to be, stuffed into $20,000 a year as a basic income. That's just, you're not going to get anywhere on it. But the way you get people to accept it is in the midst of a pandemic like this, the government says, here, let us help you out. We'll give you $600 a month. We'll give you $1,000 a month. All of it conditioning so that when the government finally says, hey, what we really need is a universal income that applies across the board so everybody is not going to be in poverty and has a sustainable life, we'll give it to you. People having already conditioned to accept it because of the hopelessness of the situation are quick to say, yeah, we'll do it. See, the notion of a universal income way back when was one that when it was first floated, it was like, oh man, this is crazy. But now the rise of gradualism and the exploiting of the current conditions and then the incremental providing of it conditions people to accept it. Well, when you have a universal income that is funded by general business, run by government, guess what that does? It destroys economies. It really does. I mean, it might sound like a good, noble idea, and it helps people out in other places, but what you are doing is destroying initiative. You are destroying God-given rights to own and produce your own by essentially subsidizing. And the World Economic Forum has as this basis what is called the Great Reset. Fortunately, our premier here in Alberta has said he is not buying into the Great Reset. And I think one of the things that we could do as believers, knowing that this type of thing that is being promoted by globalists, the few in order to destroy the many so that they can come to the rescue for them, is to write our premier and say, you know, I'm thankful that you are not wanting to implement the Great Reset. But since you are a defender of not wanting to implement the Great Reset, how about opening up our economy so that we don't go into a Great Reset? And if he's going to say he's not going to implement it, then give us the solution that works. Let people produce and keep us out of that kind of thing. I think we ought to write him and ask him about that and encourage him to do it. Point is, some of these things I'm showing you tonight is not to be conspiratorial, not to place fear within your heart. I want you to understand, God said these things are going to happen in the future. So naturally the question would be, how do we get there? And if we see that these things are occurring, it's an evidence that what God has said is true, it's right. God said it will come in the future, and as we see it happening now, we know that God is keeping His word. But it also reminds us that these solutions that are being promoted in order to solve the ills and the problems of mankind are excluding a very important component. And that is the only problem, the only solution to the problem of the ills of mankind is Jesus Christ. Any people, any country that has embraced Jesus Christ, been converted, has embraced what Christ teaches, is a country that ultimately lifts people out of the doldrums of what they are in and gives them freedom. I don't want to toot the horn about the United States, but that's why the United States ended up being what it was. It's no longer that anymore because the U.S. has turned its back on Jesus. But it got to where it was because it embraced the fact of freedom in Christ is essential to a society, and the promotion of the teaching of freedom in Christ from sin frees people, and they in turn live free, produce freely, and become exceptional people. Well, the desire of an anti-Christ thinking and government is just the opposite. So this fourth kingdom is yet to come. But we see characteristics of it right now. And we need to be reminded that what we see is coming from an antichrist, anti-godly, or anti-God motive and intent. It is a spiritual warfare that's preparing mankind for the rule of the greatest anti-God, anti-Christ person ever, the Antichrist himself. So be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might, and be wise with a sound mind and not consumed with fear.